Perfect. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our September virtual tasting for the Forgotten Grapes Wine Club. Thank you so much for joining us, those of you who are here live, and of course, those of you watching this on replay. We are excited that you are checking out our discussion with Billy Davies of Billy D and Ramble Wines. Of course, we're going to be tasting through all four wines, so have those ready to drink if you are joining us tonight. And as always, we will be muting everybody. So if you have any questions, please throw them into the chat. I will be monitoring that so I can pick those up and ask Billy any questions that you might have. Of course, we'd love to hear your food pairing suggestions as well. We'll talk about those as we get in the course of the evening, find out what you're eating with the wines tonight or what you'd like to eat with the wines tonight. Also, as you may have noticed, Allison is not with us this evening. She is on assignment. I know, pout away, Carrie. That's all right. I think I'll be able to carry the burden without her. She is in Sicily right now at Etna Fest, I think they call it, or something fancy like that. But yes, she is sad. It is, only 2:36 in the morning there. I was a little disappointed that she wasn't going to be able to log in and join us, but apparently she needs her beauty sleep. So c'est la vie. Awesome. So excited to welcome our September featured winery of the month, the winemaker for both Billy D and Ramble Wines. Billy Davie is here with us. Billy Davies, I should say. The proper Welsh pronunciation. I assume that's the origin of that.
Yep.
And as we always do, Billy, I'd love to start by finding out what is the most memorable bottle of wine that you have ever opened.
Okay. Well, nice to meet all of you, and thank you for the opportunity to share in this evening in the conversation. So I have to admit, sometimes I'm not that great at following instructions. So what's my favorite bottle, most memorable wine I've ever?
You can do favorite bottle. That's fine too.
I'm gonna remember a few things. So I grew up with this business in my blood, Schramsberg, and sparkling wine was like part of my DNA. So there are a pair of 1966s that stand out in memory. And sometimes remembering like your favorite bottle of wine is just like, it's an emotional experience too. But I was in Champagne. The company was incredible. We were with the Bollinger, the Bizos of Bollinger. We were drinking 1966 Bollinger Grand Année from Magnums with like the family, Christian Bizot and his wife and my mom and dad. So that looms very large. The wine was incredible. I'll never forget. And I remember drinking 1966 Schramsberg Blanc de Blanc at a wine spectator tasting where the wine spectator came to Schramsberg, where I grew up. And we tasted every vintage of Schramsberg that we had access to at that time. The 65 was the first vintage ever of Schramsberg, but the 66 was just like stood out as being amazingly good. So those are a pair of wines that just jumped to my mind. And I've had other amazing drinking 1974s, drinking 61 Lafite, which was my birth year from Magnum. So there's a few things. I didn't just say one.
No, that's okay. It's very rare that we get a winemaker who says just one on this one.
I could go on.
I imagine. I'm curious. Have you looked into the reason why the 66 were so good? 66s, I guess it would be, both in Champagne and in California, because it seems like it's rare to have both areas with such primo vintages.
I agree. I think that's more of a random and personal, kind of treasure. I do remember just like how phenomenal that champagne was, with the Bizots at their, chateau in Champagne. And the 66 Schramsberg was just like a surprise. I'm not saying it's the best ever Schramsberg vintage that was made, but in that tasting, in that moment, given the age that it had and just how much it, sort of resonated and stood out in that moment. Sometimes you just, you don't shake something like that. So what can I say?
No, absolutely. So I definitely want to touch on your history and growing up, because you are I won't say you're the Forrest Gump of winemaking, but you have certainly been a part of winemaking royalty, or kind of seen the evolution of Napa Valley over the last, gosh, at this point, 50 plus years.
How many years? Can I even admit how many years?
We'll be generous. We won't throw out the 7 decades thing, but
Well, I mean, hey, it started in 1965, and I was 4 years old, and my dad and mom had this crazy idea that they were going to come to the Napa Valley. They were looking around at these properties. Napa wine had this illustrious past, from the 1800s, but after Prohibition and other chapters in life, Napa was so sleepy. In '65, there were only 12 wineries that were actually open for business, during that exact time frame when I first arrived there. Hard to even imagine. And places like Schramsberg or Chateau Montelena, Farniente, they were empty. No one was there. So arriving in the Napa Valley with my dad, we went up this like rutted dirt road up to the Schramsberg property, this big old Victorian house from 1875. There was no furniture but a grand piano, and the place just had bats like flying around in this old like haunted mansion. So that was the Napa Valley that I walked into, and it was an amazing time. It was an amazing time.
It went to this screen.
That is amazing. So what was it that drew your parents to Napa, that drew your parents to the wine industry? Obviously back in 65, 66, wine, such a different animal. I mean, it was such a different business, a different product to a certain extent. So what was it that drew them to that area and drew them to this business?
I would say, as a couple, they both had, overlaps of interest with, just like finer things in life, with art, with food. My mom was really, very tuned into great food. She was a great cook, a great chef in her own right. My dad, prior to marrying and, meeting and marrying my mom, had been a member of the San Francisco Wine and Food Society. So he was like exploring interest in wine back with, it was all male, black tie, the Tastavan hanging or the around the neck. And but he was like intrigued with art and wine, and so when they got together as a couple, it took a while, but they resolved in this like idea that they wanted to create their own business together. They were going to leave like the business world that dad worked in. Mom had an art background, so but there were things that they were both interested in, and I think there was just like this dreamer sort of creative. And there's something that was also very magical about the Napa Valley, as still to this day. But you can imagine like walking into the Napa Valley like back in the 60s with the old 1800s property and like hardly anybody there, and it was just like this magic that was ready to be rekindled somehow. And not everyone like got that or thought that made any sense. But I guess thinking about them then and me now, like why did I go, and we'll talk about this more, but why did I like sort of jump back in and start like a new old wine business again just a few years ago? And part of that was like, what was like, there was this spirit, and there was something that was like really down to earth and adventurous and like fun about that Napa Valley experience. So I remember that about those like 60s and 70s years, and they were like part of that vanguard of like dreamers that came to like rediscover that.
Oh yeah, there's that great book Napa at First Light, and then there's Napa at High Noon and Napa at Last Light, which kind of chronicles over several decades. Very controversial book, I know, because of the
Jim
authors.
Conway's books.
Yes,
I'm
exactly.
actually in the first page of one of those books. He's talking about like the old international pickup truck like jostling up the road to Schramsberg, and like Billy standing on the floorboards looking out, and Jamie, my mother, with the pale green eyes. And it's in the very beginning of the book Napa by James Conway.
That's amazing. So were your parents aware of, I'm drawing parallels to, I know in Napa here in Paso we have the same thing. So many over the last 10 years, 15 years, you've had this kind of new wave of winemakers who weren't necessarily, agricultural people or brought up in the business, who have moved in, bought land, created brands for better or for worse. You can make arguments in both ways, but were your parents kind of aware of, just how agricultural the wine business was? You mentioned their tastes and their love of art and things like that, but it's farming. Let's be
Yeah.
honest. It's not an easy life, and I think a lot of people get a rude awakening when they buy a property, buy a vineyard, think it's going to be all tasting room and parties and savoring of bottles, and they get there and realize that they've got to be up at 5 in the morning and lighting barrels on fire to keep frosts at bay in the middle of February and March and whatnot.
What you're saying is, well said. And I think that they, were very much like in the spirit and embracing that. And it's true that they didn't have like farming background and, like wine making background. They had like vision, they had passion, they had love of food and, like the world of wine. And they had like a vision about the sort of the possibility for the reincarnation or the ascendancy of great wine in Napa. But dad, I remember like he embraced, just like the visceral sort of rugged hands-on, reality. And it was very small and we didn't have very much help. And there weren't that many resources back then. I mean, you really didn't have like companies that did all these jobs and work and all that. And the cast of characters, that you had to go and try to get help from. I mean, we had a Guatemalan guy. We had, people from up at Angwin that went to the like Pacific Union College. It was sort of a smattering of people from all over that, might have helped. And the industry wasn't really evolved to like the kind of workforce or the kind of like supporting, companies and resources, anything like what we have today. So I guess back to your question, I think they clearly saw that and knew that. And they were just willing to plunge in and have a lifestyle change.
Yeah. And I apologize for asking so many questions about your parents, but
Oh, no.
I will get to questions about you. I do have one more about your parents, which is, how did they ultimately decide on sparkling wine?
Yeah.
Because, obviously that's what Schramsberg has become known for. And also along those lines, it's interesting that they decided to keep the Schramsberg name rather than, name it the Davies
Yeah.
winery or whatnot. So take us through the thought process behind those two things.
Yeah, very, like clear for me. So first of all, about the name, I just, I could just picture, my dad and mom talking about it. I mean, there was no question for them. Like part of what they signed up for, part of what they loved was, the sort of the living ghost and the history and, like everything that had happened back in the 1800s and the solemnity of old Mr. Schramm and what he stood for. And so there was no question, like, Schramsberg, it meant Schramm's Mountain. And they honored, that like those, that, creation in the early years of the Napa Valley. And so, from my mind, like they never even considered like not using the name Schramsberg, because that was like anchored in something that was real that they want to give honor to. Robert Louis Stevenson, the writer, would come and visit with Mr. Schramm, and there was so much like rich history of what happened. So they honored that. And then regarding why sparkling wine, and I think they were calling it Napa Valley Champagne then.
Right. Yeah. They could use the champagne name.
So really, a couple of things. One is that I feel like, in a way, it was sort of a nod to my mother because of this, like beautiful, maybe more feminine side of the partnership with the bubbles and, just like this gorgeous, type of wine. And I also think that there was like a vision and a marketing sensibility, like from my dad's side, that he felt, or they felt, that they could really pioneer this. Like there were examples of like, Andre Chelichev making, like the great Cabernets that, Georges Latour, Beaulieu, and, there were examples of great wines, but in their mind, like they could be the first to rival the quality of champagne and do that in California. And people thought that was crazy. And they just persevered and they believed in it and they never gave up in it. And, look at what they did.
Yeah, it's amazing. And the fact that, I mean, that property and that brand still exists today and is thriving is just a testament to, all the hard work and forethought that they've put into it. So growing up in the area, what are your first, memories of that area? And was, wine something that was always in your blood? Was it something that you always wanted to pursue, or was there kind of a more languid path to get you back into the wine business?
It's true that, being in school age and, up through high school and, even into college, I wasn't always exactly clear where my career was going. I will say that, growing up and literally like growing up on this property, it was this mountain vineyard in the 60s. And it was an adventure up there, and it was, out of town. And there were, sort of characters that were up there helping and working on the property. There were, young Mexican, people living on the property. We had sort of like a bunkhouse down in the barn, and there were, first there was a family, a Mexican family that lived on the property. I mean, so I'd be coming home from school, like learning Spanish as a 6-year-old, like working up in the vineyard. I had this, what to me is still like the most amazing, like there's a richness of that, all that contact with the land on a rustic scale. So, small machinery, like in an old, D2 tractor, and sort of doing a lot of work yourself and working in the garden, and, like just like having to learn Spanish, and, picking grapes as a young kid, and, working in the caves, so I can still like smell like the dirt. I can smell like what that smelled like in the caves. There were dirt floors in the caves back then, and all that. I guess, just when I think of that experience, like I think of this very, like impressions, like to the senses
Mhm.
of like what it was like being in that dirt, and then going to school in town, and it was a small, community. St. Helena was nothing fancy back then. I mean, it was really down to earth, and we were in a close knit community. I'm learning how to play trumpet and band, and starting in the 4th grade, and so it was a small, tight knit community. And then there was also like a real sense of like the closeness of the land, and these like hands-on activities of like reviving this old mountain property. And, that was a big part of my upbringing, which I, think it was a treasure.
Nice. That's fantastic. So was winemaking something that you always wanted to pursue in high school and college, or were you kind of like, what, I do it day in and day out as a kid, I want to do something else, I don't want to go into the family business just yet?
Yeah, I didn't know. I like to work, so I did a lot of jobs, and I'd be working in the vineyard, suckering and tying, or learning how to do pruning, or, picking grapes, or I'd be working down the cellars, on the bottling, crew, or, like stacking the champagne bottles on tirage in the caves. And I did all the different jobs. I wasn't necessarily committed, knowing what I wanted to do in my career. I did not study like enology and viticulture, because for one, I was like more inclined in, English and on the verbal side, and, not so strong in math and science. But as I got like towards the end of high school, I mean, I went into college, I still wasn't like 100% clear where my career was going, but it started to get like more firm. And my dad was a great mentor, and he also gave us some space, and he encouraged us just to go and work and get experience in different ways. And I remember at one point, him saying, "Hey, if, of course we'd love it if you boys, would really want to make a commitment and be involved in this business." And, at one point he said, "My suggestion, like, if you're ready, like to start your working career, go work for somebody else for a while." So for me, my first moves ended up being like on the sales and marketing side.
Mhm.
And I went to work for Southern Wine and Spirits, which has become like the largest wholesaler in the United States. I then worked for like Beringer Wine World, which has this whole collection of wines that were interesting at that time. And I did some different jobs like that. I'd, gone through undergrad in a liberal arts, kind of background in college. But, by taking some steps like that, I really started becoming more and more drawn into it. And of course, I worked like summers and different vacations and stuff like that, helping to sell wine and do other stuff. So I just started drawing, becoming more drawn to it, following my dad's cues. And so my career went into the sales and marketing side of wine. And I eventually became the director of sales and marketing for Schramsberg. And then I've done other projects, on my own, outside of the family business.
Nice. So yeah, sometimes you have to get away from the family business to learn and see the rest of the world and not get into that bubble that you can get caught up in. By the way, folks, if you have not yet opened up the Chenin Blanc, the 2021 Chenin Blanc, please do. Yes, most of you have. That's excellent. We'll be talking about that in a second, but I do want to kind of jump in. So you're doing the sales and marketing side of thing. You're back at the family business in Schramsberg. So what spurred you to launch the Ramble and Billy D lines?
Well, I had this independent, sort of entrepreneur, vibe in me, like my mom and dad, clearly had. And so I was, along the way in my career, drawn to starting, some new things. And I've always been involved. Well, I mean, for many, many years, going back into the 90s, was very interested in just as a consumer and as looking at what I think is great for the planet and important for people, which was like organic food and, like the healthy raising up of food. I got involved in California certified organic farmers back, in the 90s. I sort of segued out of wine for a while and helped people build like an organic rice, venture and like reclaiming, sort of different types of rice and growing them organically. I got involved in grass-fed beef. And so, this was like a long time before some of these things were as like well situated as they are. But if you look at some of those interests of mine, and then look at where I am today with Billy D Wines, the other thing that's like taken me back to like why start this wine business, after all these other things that I've done. I came back to my roots, and I had taught wine business at Cal Poly, and I'd been involved.
Pun intended, I assume. Getting back to your roots.
Yeah. But I'm thinking about the future of wine, and I'm thinking, that matters to me. It's like, what is it that like, does wine really matter? And my answer is yes, it does. Like, it's like it helps connect people together. And in my travels in life in the world, like just those moments where of course, like the early days of Napa being like an amazing memory, or being in Portugal, or like being in Austria or Champagne or other places, like what wine like meant to people and how it helped them express where they came from, how it like elevated the conversation, like it was interesting, it like fascinated people, it drew folks together, it made them proud. I mean, there were all these things, and just how wine can like with food make just like any ordinary day like a more significant or interesting experience. So coming back to like why now, I like wine really matters. And thinking about like my daughter, I have 2 kids, so my kids are in their like mid 20s. And I'm thinking about like new generations, and I'm thinking back to like that experience that I had in the old Napa Valley that was so exciting and fun and like adventurous and down to earth. And it was, there was something like, there's a great vibe about that. So in starting Billy D Wines today, it's like, I know more about this wine business in like Northern California and the like, Mendocinos, Napa, these places where I grew up. Like I've traveled and done other stuff, but I know more about this than anything else. And I think that there's a neat story to be told of like going back and revisiting some things that were very cool about like older chapters in California wine and making that fresh and modern and interesting for like consumers of today. So that was like the inspo for me, like sort of inspired by like, this like black and white pictures and this, fun vibe of the earlier Napa Valley. What were the grape varieties that we had back then? We had Chenin Blanc. We had like Napa Gamay. Mm-hmm. We had Charbono. It wasn't just all like, Cabernet,
yep.
98 points, Robert Parker, all that. No, it was like, there was a lot of personality and there was like fun in it. So Billy D Wines like goes back and remembers and sort of takes a fresh take. And, and with my daughter involved, by the way, who's doing like all the artwork on the labels. So there's a 3rd generation Davies. And so that's really where it came from. And, and natural wine that's made from organic grapes. And, like I don't use winemaking additions. It's basically like 0-0. I'm really into that, like just sort of this tight wire of making great wine without having to mess with it. And it all like comes down to like the grape sources and when you pick and, how you guide things through the cellar, without letting anything go off the rails.
Yeah.
Anyway, those are some of the philosophies.
Yeah. So was this something that you had kind of always had in your mind and been planning and researching, or was there like an aha moment when you said, oh, I've done all this other organic thing, I have this background, like I think it's time for me to launch my own wine brand?
Yeah, it was not like something that I had always planned, this comeback all along. I was thinking about doing something that was meaningful. And I cared about like the future of, younger consumers. I cared about like the intersection of wine with what it meant to people, with like the environment, where the wines are grown, the land. I cared about those things. I cared about like the crossroads of like thoughts, and like sort of leadership and like where's wine, heading, or where does it need to go in the future? And so how can I, make my best, impact on that? Is it being like involved with a university as a professor,
Right.
or, and I sort of dabbled in that. And it was actually out of that teaching experience with all these young students that I started like look at where you actually came from. Look at like the opportunity to like sort of go back and re-seize like something that was like refreshing and cool about like that old time in California. I actually used some of my students to help me when I was kicking it off. And then my
Nice.
daughter joined in. And so I just like sort of evolved out of that, like maybe actually going back and making wine again, but by having this mission about like the unique varieties and lower alcohol and like healthier wine and all this, and this kind of fun vibe about it. That all stacked up to be, I'm in, like we're, this is it.
Yeah.
So
And it's
it
it's
didn't.
interesting. I mean, you were just dealing with, some very small issues like the future of wine and, wine consumers and whatnot. But
Uh-huh.
what's interesting is for such a forward-looking brand doing, the raw wine, natural winemaking, which we'll talk about, it's still at the same time very retro in its same uh way, because you're dealing with these really, lesser known, obscure, forgotten grapes, what we love here, what we specialize in, what we adore, and kind of really bringing back the history of California. It's such an interesting dichotomy between those two things. Have you found that kind of the newer generation of wine lovers who may not be familiar with these grapes, they really latched on to this?
Well, I like, some things that you're landing on there, like the idea of retro and the idea of also being like fresh and moving forward and like embracing the future. So to me, that is like what's exciting. And it's true that I have this like vantage point of like having, this experience in this, very interesting family environment and this like great chapter of like an earlier Napa Valley and all that stuff. So I could go back and look at retro and like what was really, what's provocative about that today that I'd like to share and bring forward. And then, but to your question about how are younger consumers, maybe, or any consumers identifying with like lost and found varieties, or, sort of like returning a focus to something like Charbono or Carignan or French Colombard or, whatever. I think
Valdiguié, yeah.
people are interested. It's not exactly mainstream. So, maybe you have to do a little more work. It also, though, makes it like, for me, that's where the passion is. It's like, that's because it's really interesting and people's eyes light up, when you tell the story about what was Napa Gamay, and like, that was something like really significant in the old days of Napa. Today we call it Valdiguié, but beautiful wine. And, it's sort of like people are, I think on one hand, people are always like interested in sort of what's next. Like, yes, like anything but Chardonnay or whatever. I mean, on the one hand, yes, there's more Chardonnay being sold than, any and all of so many of these other whites. At the same time, people are excited about discovering something, that's like a discovery. And anyway, I put these little bottles out here because we were talking about, new interpretations and whatever. And so Ramble, the brand, sort of like Ramble in time, and Ramble like going back to the old varieties and old plantings, by the way, like vines that are, planted, 1944, and
Yeah.
old vineyard plantings. That sort of formed the basis of Ramble. And then with Abby and me thinking about, we couldn't just do one thing. We wanted to do something, even more sort of provocative in the way of packaging. And the Billy D logo is this Billy goat that's on the back, and you can see one here too. So it's sort of like bucking the usual, and I always have to remember that every day. But we put like really good wine from old vineyards in these little 500 milliliter bottles. So that's the Billy D label. So this is like Carignan from 90-year-old vines. This is like French Colombard. This is Daydreamer Rosé, which comes from Valdiguié-Barbera. And we're not tasting that tonight, but that's another thing that we do to be like embracing the future. And this really has legs. Like people, to ask, you know, your question about what do people are reacting to this. It's like ultra lightweight glass. It's like the benefits of what you might see in canned wine, but it's a lot better because you could actually put the cap back on. You can see the color of the wine. You can, it's an elevated experience.
That's so interesting. So how do you decide what wines go into the Billy D and what wines go into the Ramble? Do you have, you know, separate vineyards for both, or is there like, are you and Abby kind of tasting through things and deciding, okay, this goes into one, this goes in the other?
And this is evolving too, you know, like, we start and it's like proof of concept, and I'm doing this, like jumping in as an entrepreneur, and I, sort of self-funding this, and, have primarily like Abby and a couple of, like kitchen cabinet people to help. Where I see it going now is that with the Billy D, like those little bottles that I showed you, that's going to be like exclusively organic, like CCOF certified organic grapes with the certification that's just there for anybody to see. Don't have to tell the story about it being practicing organic, whatever, be on the label. This is like as we go forward. It's going to be a red blend, a white blend, and a rosé. So there'll be blends that take advantage of, accessing these sort of old school varieties, but each one will be a blend. So it'll be a red blend, a white blend, and a rosé type of blend. And then I see Ramble being like this opportunity in 750 milliliter to maybe focus on a single vineyard, or focus on like a single variety like Charbono, or maybe something that's just produced in maybe it's only like 75 cases. Maybe these become more like your natural wine club, sort of like the esoteric smaller production. And then the little bottles are like there that we're sort of growing that, taking it out to the world in a bigger way. That's how I see it.
Got it. So yeah, the Billy D wines are a little bit more of the distributed side, try to appeal to a wider group of the masses. And then the true wine geeks, or, kind of that core group, you bring them into Ramble to really get them into the depth of the individual vineyards, individual grapes, and the full expression of it.
And like I say, we're, it's like we're sort of moving, like in that direction. Like right now, I mean, those little Billy D bottles have like, there's 80-year-old, Valdiguié vines, going into the rosé. It's like 90-year-old Carignan vines. I mean, it's organic labeling on the back label. So they're at a special level. But I do feel like there's an opportunity to share natural wine and not be afraid of it, because we're making really good wine, and share that with a broader audience. Like, why wouldn't we want to do that? If we can help this, transformation of like more organically farmed acres, and like creating, a bigger market for that. We want to be a part of that. We want to be, we want to help change the way people drink that way, not just be part of it, but instigators.
Yeah. And that's a good transition. You mentioned single varietal and single vineyard into the Chenin Blanc that we're drinking, 2021. And this comes from the Heringer Vineyard in Clarksburg, which I know has a very long and storied history. I actually kind of did some research when I was writing up the email on this, and was shocked by how old and how esteemed this vineyard is.
Well, the family is, a very long, like many generation California farming family. The Heringer family, like 7 generations in California farming, and this area in Clarksburg, we call it like the Delta. It's like where the Sacramento River, sort of meanders out of the Sacramento Valley and starts to approach the San Francisco Bay. So you do have some cooler air that, embraces, or that, sort of nourishes that area. Chenin Blanc is doing very well there.
Yes,
and so anyway, I'm very intrigued, with Chenin Blanc from there. I also make under this Ramble wine, group of wines. We make a Chenin Blanc from this Mendocino vineyard too, called Buddha's Dharma, which is like 80-year-old Chenin Blanc vines, and it's exceptional. So anyway, 2 different Chenin Blancs. I love Chenin Blanc. So that's just one of the reasons, like, why do this, because I felt like Chenin Blanc like one of the great white wine varieties of the world. I mean, I love the Loire. I just think it's, these are magical wines. And it actually had this interesting place, like in the older days of California. When I was a kid, we had Chenin Blanc, like in the Napa
Oh, yeah.
Valley. So it was like good timing to bring, sort of like the spotlight or interest or focus back to Chenin Blanc. And I think you're seeing, like other younger winemakers, doing that kind of thing today. It's a great variety. It has like, why did old timers have these varieties planted? They did well, in our areas of California where we are. Chenin Blanc, had good acidity. It could actually do pretty well in a range of climates, including, some warmer areas like inland Mendocino. So same with like Barbera and Napa Gamay. These grapes, like they were well suited, like the people that planted them 100 years ago, they had good rationale for that. And then everything sort of went, by the pendulum swung, and it wasn't, like Chardonnay was fashionable and everybody tore all this stuff out. But I think Chenin is gorgeous. It, it has like this spectrum of, on the one hand, like this acidity and sort of minerality and like citrus, like laser focus. And then there's also what I've heard people call like petrol. Like you'll hear sometimes people refer to Riesling, like the little bit of an oiliness, the viscosity, like just, touches that. And I recognize that here. I mean, primarily it's a really fresh and it's a brisk wine, but it has this textural, like, sort of petrol bit of viscosity to it too, that I think is interesting about Chenin Blanc. You can sort of span that spectrum. Anyway, those are some thoughts about
Yeah,
Chenin.
no, Chenin is one of the most versatile grapes. I mean, there's a reason why it was the workhorse white grape, basically up until the 80s, early 90s. If you opened a bottle of Carlo Rossi jug wine that was Chablis or Rhine or whatever it was invariably, there was quite a bit of Chenin Blanc in there because it could be
And French Colombard.
exactly, yeah. Yeah, those two were kind of hand in hand as the
Good acid, like good backbone of wines. And,
but if you wanted
it's
to
that
leave some,
recognize
oh, go ahead.
people, those wine, like French Colombard is still very important actually in the big, larger wine industry for good reasons. It's just, now, the only people, that talk about it is sort of like these little hipster things where, oh, we're rediscovering like an old French Colombard vineyard, and it's cool. But reality is there's still French Colombard that's important in the California wine industry.
Oh yeah, believe me, in my sparkling wine business, I'm having to explain to people how my sparkling wine is different than the other sparkling wines from Paso Robles that tend to be a French Colombard blend by one house that everybody just sort of throws their labels on as shiners. But that's not something I'll get into here. But this Chenin really unique, and I know you guys produce this in a slightly different way. There's a little bit of skin contact into this Chenin, which I think adds more of that body, that richness, and gives it there's almost just a touch of like an oxidized quality to it, but in a really way that enhances more of the apple flavors, gives it almost that kind of like caramelized apple note to it, I found.
Yeah, I think there's, again, like sort of within this one wine that's actually like less than 12% alcohol, there's quite a span and spectrum of flavor and like sort of like liveliness and, like things like pulled in different directions or whatever. So yes, there's a textural component. And so I harvest the grapes. I like to get the pick, like nailed without, like missing the pick. I like to capture like the real energy and freshness and vitality in good acid, in the wine and fruit flavors. So this was picked right around 20 bricks, and most of it went like whole cluster to press. But at the same time, there's a portion of it that went into a bin to do a skin ferment. So that was whole cluster. And I actually foot treaded that, myself, which I sort of get up there and what does that do? I mean, you're basically like creating sort of like juice channels so that you're allowing juice to move around sort of and surround, like the whole cluster. So you're breaking up a little bit, but not too much. Way much less disruption than like going through a stemmer crusher.
Yeah.
So, by foot treading, it's gentle and you're allowing like passageways for juice to move around, to aid like the fermentation of the whole clusters, but you're not breaking it up too much. And it's a lot of work. But anyway, so that's sort of a part of that. And so, those things are fermenting separately, like the Chenin Blanc that went to press. From there, it went to a combination of neutral wood barrels, like 10-year-old barrels, so it's not oaky. People say like, oh, they get a little oakiness, but it's like these are 10-year-old barrels, so it's really not that. And some stainless steel, like drums, like small, basically they're like stainless steel barrels. So it kind of went half and half to those things, and then with this like 20% skin ferment portion doing its thing, sort of independently, and then that went to neutral barrels too. So that's like how I was fermenting. Wild yeast, nothing added, nothing taken away. There's no filtering.
I feel like foot treading whole cluster has got to be really hard on your feet with all those stems in there.
It's definitely not, it is hard work. And I think that, and I mean, I just like taught myself, and I, got around other like natural winemakers and watched them, like ask questions or whatever. But there's definitely technique involved, and there are some people that are super good at doing it. They can do it fast, but it takes time, and yeah, it's hard on your feet. And Chenin's not the worst. When you get into some of the red varieties, like if you're going to foot tread Petite Syrah, for example, or maybe
real
even
thick
Carignan,
skins.
those are harder on your feet than like Valdiguié is not as bad because it's a little bit softer, or Chenin's not quite as bad. But anyway, so it depends on what, and it can be very cold. Like, so if your grapes are coming in from like a 6 a.m. or, starting to pick at 5 o'clock in the morning with lights or whatever, and then you're getting in that, with your feet, it's freezing cold. So yeah, it's not for the meek.
Hopefully get a nice pair of like Bombas socks or something, fresh out
And
of
I
the
know,
box to
because it's like, it's hard. Like, I've had other people, like they'll put boots on or whatever. Nah, that does not work for me. Like, it has to be your bare feet. I cannot do it any other way. You have to be able to feel it, and like, when you're like actually down to the bottom, and know how you're moving your foot through the clusters and all that. It's like, I can't do it with any shoes on or anything.
You're a bold man, my friend. Very, very bold. So at what point do you take those two kind of separate fermentations, the skin contact versus the foot tread, and blend them together? Is that something you're doing, during fermentation? Is it a blend that you're doing afterwards?
Yeah, so I didn't make that, because what's there in the winery as like the winemaking seasons goes on and all that, and it's very fun, is you just in my case have all these individual lots of wine. Like, okay, there was a 2-ton Barbera pick, or there was a 4-ton Chenin Blanc pick from this vineyard. Here's like a different Chenin Blanc pick that was another 4 tons, or some of them are small. Like, maybe I even had like a 1.5-ton lot. And so all those are like individual barrels. Like there might be a 3-barrel lot, or a 4-barrel lot, or 5 barrels or whatever of one particular thing. And so you're letting that play out, like you're letting these fermentations complete themselves in barrel, even if some of the fermentations might have started in an open, like
In the open
bin,
containers, yeah.
or, whatever, but then at some point you're going to press it off and go to barrel. So usually like, approaching dryness, or, maybe less than dry. So like on the Chenin Blanc skin ferment portion, I let that go to about 7 degrees Brix. So not all the way dry. I didn't want it to extract like too much stem and bitterness and all that, that kind of side of it. So I, didn't let it go all the way to dryness. So then that would be pressed to a barrel, and then the fermentation finishes to dryness in a barrel. And then I just have all those barrels until, through like the élevage, like through the malolactic fermentation. Because I'm, not adding anything, I don't use any, there's no SO2 anywhere during this time.
Mhm.
I do use a little bit of sulfur later, but not until post malolactic fermentation. So I'm not stopping the malolactic fermentation. So in this case, part of what you're, getting at, like in aromas and texture and whatever else, this goes through full malolactic. Every wine that I have does, and they end up still like racy acidity, like really focused, laser sharp and all that, because I start with such, nice early pick, great acidity, low pH, all that. So they can go through full malolactic, and that will offer more complexity in textural parts. And like the skin contact offers, some different dimensions in that way too. but then I still have this great, acidity and focused flavors and, freshness.
Yeah. So then you blend those together, kind of, you do some trials, I imagine. And
So yeah, as approaching, like decisions about bottling, okay, how many Chenin Blancs do I want to make? Do I, and it's like, sometimes you're tempted to keep everything separate because it's all really interesting, but you're also realizing, can I really sell like 16 wines in the marketplace? It's, you have to draw the line someplace. So, making some choices about, blending things together. And in this case, recognizing that, yeah, the stainless steel, element of the Chenin, that was all like by itself. The neutral barrel portion, that was all by itself. So you're tasting those and having fun with it all the way through the élevage. The skin ferment portion, that was all by itself too. It's like, wow, these are all cool by themselves. But then starting to play with blending and, tasting them together and putting it together in a blend and bringing it together before bottling in one blend. That's what I ended up doing.
yeah, no, it's so interesting and so unique and very different than other Chenin Blancs that we've had from California, even from the Clarksburg area, just in terms of its style. I know before we started the virtual tasting, you and I were talking a little bit about how your wines can really evolve once they're open over a couple of days. And I imagine this is a wine that would be, very different a day, 2 days, 72 hours after opening.
And thank you for saying that, because, and I recommend to, everyone who's here, participating, I would encourage you to try this wine like 2 days from now. I just use these like sort of old fashioned, like the vacuum or whatever, to remove some of the, because it's so easy. But you don't even have to do that. Just put the cork in it, put it back in the fridge. I find that like a bottle of wine like this that maybe, has a third gone or a half gone is like perfect for letting it sit, another couple of days or so. And then coming back.
What about 5/6? Because that's where I'm at.
Yep,
Right
I'm not afraid of that.
Okay, good. All right, just checking.
The more wine that's still in the bottle, then it will last longer. So if you're down to like 10%, then I don't recommend leaving that for 6 days.
No,
But if you have
it. I mean, come on.
2/3 of a bottle or half a bottle, try that, many days later. I recommend that.
Nice. Excellent. So we always love to talk about food pairings with the wine. So what are some food pairings that you would recommend with this particular Chenin Blanc?
I love food, and I love like trying all kinds of wines and breaking rules and all that stuff too. So, yes, with this, I mean, it's easy for me to think of like sort of like, what would you, what do you think of wines of the Loire, or even like Muscadet and like shellfish and all that? Like, I think that's great. It makes total sense. And I love that kind of combination. I also think about like charcuterie, like with this Chenin Blanc, I like the counterpoint of, some of like the fat in like dry meats, so imagine like, whether it's like prosciutto or like a copa or something like that. And the Chenin Blanc being counterpoint. I think of like, and I just like eating this way, sort of like rustic picnic fare of like dried cheeses, like charcuterie, olives, like different kinds of nuts, like I think the Chenin Blanc is great with just like a smattering of things like that. And, welcome other thoughts, but I mean, it's a great food wine, and it has this like cleansing acidity that can stand up to, I mean, you could have this with sweetbreads, for example. Like imagine like, like the cleansing or the,
be
like
careful.
the
We have some vegans on the virtual tasting tonight. So
all right, well, and I can do
no, you
well,
don't. I was being facetious, but no, I could definitely like some sauteed sweetbreads with this would be phenomenal.
It's good for me to, and it's definitely good for me to not, and I'll go like, many nights of the week without eating meat too, and I like that.
Yeah.
And anyway, there's a wide range of things that I think can be exciting.
Yeah, Matt and Carrie, who are kind of our resident gourmet, or resident foodies here, gourmands, our foodies here, had a roasted cauliflower soup with this and said it was delicious.
Sounds great.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. And to me, what's interesting is I could see this with kind of not a hard cheese, but like a medium bodied, but a nuttier cheese. So I'm thinking of kind of some of the softer Italian cheeses that are out there, or even like I'm not a huge Gouda fan, especially the smoked Goudas. I think the smoke might be a little overpowering, but just a regular Gouda would be really interesting with this. I think that kind of salty nuttiness with the richness of this and the viscosity, like you were talking about, that petrol would be a really interesting pairing.
Great ideas. I can totally appreciate, visualize that.
Yeah, even something as simple as like a baked potato with sour cream and chives, I think would be super interesting. Just creamy, rich, and then this has that acid, but also that body. I think that would be really unique.
I liked hearing about the cauliflower soup. I actually think that's a great
Yeah,
i-
that's yeah.
idea of a
They're like 3 steps ahead of the rest of us when it comes to food pairing. So we always kind of follow Matt and Carrie's leads. Matt's especially, but that's why he stepped off. He's getting his flowers right now off the camera. It's getting the next course.
All
So
right. Well,
speaking of which, yeah, let's talk
coming, Matt.
about. Go ahead.
No, I just said keep it coming. We've got some other wines ahead, so we'll have more feedback.
Yeah, so this is the Forgotten Grapes Wine Club, and we love our lesser known, and obviously Chenin Blanc falls in that. But this next wine is just like between this and the Charbono, which we'll talk about in a second. I mean, this is what drew me towards you, like a tractor beam on the Death Star. This is the 2021 Valdiguié-Barbera, and of course, you mentioned earlier, Valdiguié for many years was known as Napa Gamay. I believe was one of like the 3 most widely grown grapes in California. It was basically Heringer, Napa Gamay, and Charbono, if I remember correctly, were like back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s were pretty much the dominant 3 varietals of California red winemaking.
Well, I would love to get like some more firm information on that, because I love history like that, and I love how it reinforces sort of good things that are relevant to revisit again. I remember Napa Gamay being very much a part of the landscape in the Napa Valley for me as a kid. So I have like a personal sort of like a feeling and connection about Napa Gamay when my dad and mom were pioneering and creating the very first vintages of Schramsberg. The Blanc de Blanc was like the number one, the very first wine that we made. But within a couple of years, they wanted to make a rosé sparkling wine. They felt that was something very important. And guess what? It was Cuvée de Gamay. It was made from Napa Gamay. The early Schramsberg rosé was not from Pinot Noir. It was from Napa Gamay. I love just like the sort of the weight and the different kind of profile of flavors of what I can still fondly think of as Napa Gamay. Definitely, and I think in picking it, like I make, this is red wine from it. I also make rosé, by the way, from Valdiguié, Napa Gamay, and I love the rosé, and I also really love the red. It's, I mean, when I pour it, I mean, I can see through it. I mean, it's got more of a translucent color. It's not, like deep and heavy and dark. I could, by pick, like if I were to pick this at 25 bricks or something, it would look a lot darker. But this was picked at 20 bricks also, like right at 20 bricks. And I think it really captured my experience, like with, Valdiguié that I've had, is that if you let it go too far, like if you let it ripen too much, you kind of miss like what it is that's very energetic and, sort of different and special about Valdiguié. So I don't want to miss that. Like I'd like to, catch it by like 21 bricks, um, anyway, I'm going off on different things, but
That's what we do here.
the by the way, there's some Barbera in this blend too. It's like
Yes.
23% or 25% Barbera. The leaf shapes are on the label. My daughter Abby, has been my partner in all this like work with the labels, and I don't know if you can see these things. You looked at them a little bit before, but that's actually me having a ramble in the vines. It's a picture that Abby took of the vineyard, and then like worked with it in interesting ways to to make it more of an abstract expression. But on the Chenin Blanc label, that figure who's walking the vines, that's like Billy D, having to ramble in the vines. Photograph taken by Abby. And then Abby did, this like rendering of the different leaf shapes with sort of like a tendril of, leaf, or I mean, a vine, like that's like wavering through. Anyway, we can talk more about that. The Charbono, these are like the split berries of carbonic maceration of Charbono. So all the labels tie back to something that's actually about the vineyard or something, like from the wine, but they're in a creative, sort of journey of an expression. So back to the wine, Valdiguié. I just love that aroma. And yes, there's a little tints of Barbera there too.
So is
It's
that
really,
go
it's
ahead.
like it's got like direct, fruit tones that speak to me. But I also like the earth. Like I like wine that speaks of both fruitiness and like the idea of terroir or earth at the same time. Like I like that kind of complexity where it's not just sort of like simple fruit, but there's something that's like a little bit dark or underlying or interesting or intriguing about the land showing through. And I think this does that.
Yeah. Excuse me, when we were talking about the Chenin Blanc, you mentioned the Buddhist Dharma vineyard. You source Chenin from there. Obviously, this Valdiguié-Barbera blend is sourced from that vineyard. Is this a co-ferment of those two grapes? Is this more of a field blend, or are they separate blocks? Are you harvesting them separately and then blending them together? How is that working? Because and how did you decide on Valdiguié and Barbera? Because such different grapes. Obviously, they both have origins in California history, but French versus Italian, so unique.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And so as far as the vineyard goes, that Buddhist Dharma vineyard, which was just a treasure for me to encounter, planted in 1944, dry farm, certified organic, old school vineyard, just like amazing old vines. And it was planted in Napa Gamay, Barbera, Chenin Blanc. There are a couple other things there that I've never worked with, but those were the things that were the most fascinating for me. And as far as like how I picked it, interesting, like in 2021, it was all picked at the same time. The Valdiguié, the Chenin Blanc, and the Barbera was all picked like on the same pick. So they were like ready, and they were all sort of like right around the same like ripeness and bricks. It doesn't always work out that way, but that's what happened. I did not co-ferment, partly because I'm also like very curious about, hey, what happens like just all by itself with Barbera? What happens like all by itself? And it is like beautiful to just like experience and see each variety 100% on its own. I really much like that. I guess with the Valdiguié and the Barbera combination, my first foray into that was making rosé. So I knew that I wanted to make rosé from the Valdiguié. I also wanted to have really great acidity in the rosé, and the Valdiguié had really nice acidity, but the Barbera had even more. And so I found that by using like maybe 25% Barbera with the Valdiguié, that it sort of boosted, like this sort of great like vibrancy and acidity in the wine. And I liked the element that the Barbera brought. So in doing the rosé, they were co-fermented, okay, but on the red wine they were separate. So I just had Barbera that went to barrel and fermented, and then Valdiguié, and then I ended up playing around and tasting and blending and decided that I liked bringing a little bit of Barbera to the Valdiguié. It gave it a little more structure, like a little bit more like tan, just like a little bit more backbone tan structure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
But
how
Valdiguié itself is also beautiful.
nice. And how did you discover this vineyard? Did you have a connection to Buddhist Dharma, or were you? And I kind of want to. This leads to a bigger question of how do you select your vineyards? Obviously, you're looking for certified organic, more natural winemaking, grape growing processes. But how do you find your vineyards, and how do you find this one specifically?
Well, one thing that just popped in my head, it's sort of like, for my dad and mom, like finding Schramsberg was like sort of having this encounter like with the ghost of the past, or sort of like meeting like something that was coming out of time that was like preserved, or that they wanted to, like revive it. And so for me, like the vineyards are like that, like, like rediscovering, there's something just like, very, very special about finding, like an old vineyard, just like head trained, like dry farmed. Those vines are amazing. The roots go down so deep because there's never been any drip irrigation. So the roots don't like stay towards the surface going laterally. They have to go down, and they're seeking, like they're seeking moisture, they're seeking mineral, they're seeking, their sustenance. And so I think that makes really interesting wine. And how did I find these things? I mean, I guess just like asking around and like sort of having this idea of what seemed very provocative and interesting for me. First, knowing that I wanted Chenin, then, starting to think about Valdiguié, talking to people. I got lucky. I found somebody that like knew about that vineyard. Another, like, it was a young winemaker that had made some wine from there. He ended up being able to introduce me to the grower, the guy that was farming it. The grower's wife, it was her family that had owned that vineyard, like historically for generations. They were like the old Italian Mendocino family that had owned that land. And then they sold it to the Buddhist monastery, like I don't remember what year, but Troy was still farming it for them. So I just got lucky and, and got in there, and then, keep looking for other things like that. And, then once you're up there in like old Mendocino, meeting, like just, I'm good at meeting people, like turning over stones, like trying to, go from one thing to another.
Yeah.
And still doing that.
That's amazing. It's fantastic. Yeah, this is beautiful. I imagine similar to the Chenin, neutral barrels, your kind of 10-year-old barrel program or whatnot for this as well.
Yeah, I don't have any new oak. I mean, it's not like I have some sort of like, I mean, I don't really, what other people
There's no
do.
prejudice against new oak, I
Yeah, it's just
imagine.
like I don't need it. It's just like I feel like for me, it's not like I'm looking for the expression and the range of flavors and all that that's coming from the fruit and the source. And, like I don't feel like I need, sort of like this newer kind of oak to layer something else, over that. And I feel like it might mask some of the nuance, of a wine like this. So yeah, it's, but yeah, to your point, and some of this, there was a little bit of stainless steel also, like there's a little bit of carbonic maceration.
Oh,
And
interesting.
with doing, like as much whole cluster fermentation as I do, which is a fair amount, like a lot of the reds are whole cluster, foot treaded, or sometimes you can take whole cluster and put it down at the bottom of your fermentation vessel. And then if you're going to destem some, that would go on top. So you have sort of like this active whole cluster. It's almost like a semi-carbonic,
Mhm.
going on underneath.
Right.
That's like covered, there's no oxygen to it because it's underneath.
Yeah.
So anyway, doing things like that. But I did some full carbonic maceration, like a little stainless steel tank, just like packed with nothing but clusters of grapes, like just like sealing it off. No
Wow.
oxygen. Carbonic is in an oxygen, like true carbonic is in an oxygen deprived environment. So that's about 20% probably of this wine was like real carbonic maceration.
That's interesting. I mean, how did you make that decision to do carbonic? It's so unique, and it's one of those things that it feels like it's kind of become a little bit of a trend among or I won't say a fad yet, a fad, or but there's it seems like it's kind of a hot thing for winemakers to do, is to do carbonic Grenache or Syrah or Cinsault or Mourvèdre or whatever it might be. So how did you make that decision, and kind of where did you learn the technique? Because it is so unique, and so, it's a little bit risky. You're basically putting the grapes in there and kind of, I can't
I
do
know,
anything about it.
it's true. Part of it is just like this sort of uh, type of like fascination and curiosity and like wanting to try things and wanting to see what happens and sort of explore different boundaries. And so I have to admit that that's part of it. Like I want to try these things and see what see what I learn from that and see what I like or don't like. And but I also felt like intuitively that there were reasons why I wanted that carbonic element. The like I like the idea of the berries just like fermenting from the inside of the berries out.
Right.
not being, like broken and, like ruptured by the stemmer crusher. How were Romans making wine? It was like whole cluster, they were treading in the, these pits or whatever you'd call it. And, you could say, oh, but, we've learned so much and we have so much better tools today and all that. But there's also something like in so many instances, whether it's like old, cheeses or wine or whatever, like sometimes going back to the way that something was done artisanally, hundreds of years ago is informative. Like it actually was like, it's really, really good. And so whether it's bearing wine in amphoras and, wax lined, amphora or whatever. So anyway, with the carbonic, it's there's a fruit, there's like definitely like a transmission of this like fruitiness that comes from it. It it was a way to express some of the tannins in a little bit softer manner. So I have some like full like foot treaded, whole cluster fermentation and all that has more exposure to the stems and all that. But in carbonic, it's a little bit softer. So there's sort of like a balancing of bringing different things together. I don't, anyway, so I'm just explaining like why did I try these things?
No, and that's the beauty of working with these lesser known grapes and doing small batches is you can experiment and play around with things. So let's talk food pairings with this one. To me, you mentioned the Chenin Blanc with charcuterie, but this is the wine to me that just absolutely cries out for charcuterie. I want like a hot capicola, or like copa, or like a nice Genoa salami with this would be, even like a French saucisson would be tremendous with this, I think.
Great pairings. I could also see this like with a, wild caught salmon that had a really like a lot of fat and crispy skin on it. Like this sort of being a nice, counterpoint to that. It's definitely refreshing. So I like, of course, that's just sort of my way of wines in period, is that they're more of a counterpoint to food. And I think that makes sense. Like a lot of the big, like very, very powerful high alcohol wines, I'm not sure that are as good like food pairing wines with foods. But I see this, like sort of penetrating and having like relevance, with a wide range of food.
Yep. And speaking of salmon, Matt and Carrie baked salmon with lemon, parsley, dill, and feta topping. It's funny you guys mentioned feta, because the other thing I was thinking, and this is going to sound very weird with this wine, but a watermelon and feta salad with this, I think would be phenomenal.
Hey, that's a great idea.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
It's
That's
got
awesome.
such that acidity and that brightness to counteract the sweetness of the watermelon. You get the saltiness of the feta. I think that would be just so interesting.
I had a watermelon feta salad somewhere in the last, month or so, and it was a great. I love the salad. I love that combination period, and I think it's also a great illustration of a matching with this. And watermelon is something that I pick up a little bit of that in the Valdiguié, especially in the rosé. I find like a watermelon, kind of trait in the rosé. I hate to say this because it's like a candy, but it's like a hard candy Jolly Rancher, watermelon. You get a little bit of that in the rosé, but even here, like you can sort of like appreciate just like a tiny bit of that watermelon.
Watermelon Jolly Rancher, the second best Jolly Rancher flavor of all time. I will fight anybody who disagrees
But
with
along with like, sort of a blackberry and, other different kinds of fruits there too.
Absolutely.
I
No,
love it.
it's delicious. It's so unique, and I just like I mean, you are one of one in terms of a Valdiguié-Barbera blend. I don't think that's anything you will ever find, no matter how many wines you drink, how long you roam the earth. You will not see that. So never stop.
Another wine that, I think benefits from a little time, like I think if you come back and try this wine tomorrow, there's, there's definitely a little bit of, I mean, all my wines have what I would call grip.
Right.
And so this wine has some grip. I mean, there's definitely like you can sink your teeth into it. There's a little bit of tannin there. There's a savoriness, and in terms of that tannin, and that softens like as you have the wine open.
Yeah. Well, speaking of savory, I definitely picking up savory notes on the next wine, which is the 2020 Charbono. And I have to admit, this is, this was one of the main reasons that I wanted to stop and visit you at the Raw Wine Festival. I am a Charbono fanatic. It is a grape that I have loved and championed since I started Forgotten Grapes and discovered it. I still have a bottle of a 2004 Charbono from a Napa Valley vineyard that was the last vintage ever made from that particular block, because they tore it up and planted Cab or Zin or something, blasphemous on it. But yeah, you kind of walked us through with the Chenin and the Valdiguié, but I know there's less than 70 total acres of Charbono left in California, or some minuscule number. So how did you stumble upon this, or decide that this was, going to be one of your flagship wines?
Well, Charbono fits so, well, the story of sort of like revisiting an older vibe of the Napa Valley. And, I remember Charbono, and, I remember that, just sort of a little bit, as a kid, just like hearing about it. But then, as I was in my sales career, I remember trying Charbonos, like Burns Steakhouse in Tampa, has like one of the greatest places to just like open up bottles of wine. I remember like, I think it was like a 74, Inglenook Charbono or something like that I got to drink there. And, they let us have it for like $50 or something. And you're like,
yeah,
in
this of
course. Room, and so Charbono was, something very special. I remember, like the role that Charbono had in the old Napa Valley. I got to try some. And there were legendary, like there's a Charbono Appreciation Society. There's like Charbono on the Ark of Slow Food, like lost,
I need to join that appreciation society.
And the 1947, like Inglenook Charbono was supposedly legendary. So that was just like stuff that I couldn't resist. I mean, that's like, I had to go and, see if I could find my own source, of tapping into, Charbono. So, yeah, Calistoga is where, these vineyards, like to the extent that you could still find Charbono, Calistoga is one of the few places where you can.
Yeah.
There's a little tiny bit like in Sonoma and Mendocino, I think, although I've never been to those vineyards.
There's one vineyard I know of here in Paso Robles that has it.
Very little left of Charbono anymore.
Yeah. It's a shame too, because it's such an interesting grape. It's got that high acidity to it, still very bright, but at the same time with a slightly thicker skin, so you do pick up some tannin to it, and such a unique flavor profile.
And aromatically, very, very different. I mean, just after the Valdiguié, I get like a blue fruit in Charbono, whether it's sort of like towards blueberry. I don't know if blueberry is the right word, but there's like a direction of fruit that's not just red or black fruit. That's, it's sort of a different vibe of fruit that you can pick up in Charbono. And there's like a little bit of a leatheriness. There's like a beautiful, tone and theme of fruit in the Charbono. Some people like compare Dolcetto a little bit. I don't know, but I think to me, again, it sort of speaks of like the lost and found Napa Valley.
Yeah. And this wine it's really unique. To me, this has a little bit more of I use the term sauvage, that kind of, it feels a little more rugged. And I don't know if there's just a hint of like volatile acidity in this or whatnot, but it feels a little more untamed. Maybe it's just my bottle. And I'm also picking up, go ahead.
Well, there's a wildness, there's a little bit of wildness, like you say, and I like that. And there's a little bit of smokiness, like a gaminess.
Yes, that was the other thing I was going to mention, is I'm picking up a ton of smoke off of this.
But I get that in Charbono. To me, that's a trait. That sort of gaminess or smokiness is a trait of Charbono.
Yeah. And I know it was up in this vineyard is this a Mendocino based? Oh no, it's Napa Valley.
Yeah, this is Napa Valley.
So it is a 2020. Was this one that was affected by, the fires and the smoke in any way?
Yeah, I mean, everything was, although I'm pretty happy, like, and it's part of why I chose to do carbonic maceration, was to like emphasize sort of coming from the inside out, rather than emphasizing, whatever exposure had been on the outside of those clusters and berries. So, but pretty cool.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So how did you decide on carbonic maceration for this Charbono?
Yeah, I think, thinking about wanting the fermentation to begin from the inside of the berries and then go out, and to take, Charbono, which sometimes can be, it can be very dark. It has a lot of color, like Charbono is a very deep and dark, and to show, like a little bit more vibrant side of Charbono. I think sometimes Charbonos can be very, some people's can be more like sort of syrupy and thick and,
Yeah,
towards that direction. And I wanted to keep, I wanted to capture like the distinctness of Charbono and the aromatics and, some of the texture and flavor of that, but to be able to show it in a a little more energetic way. And so I think, and the carbonic, is, helped me to be able to do that.
absolutely. Did you find that, I mean, it really kind of softened up the wine and eliminated some of those tannins that we were talking about that can happen with more traditional pressed Charbono?
It's softer. It's got fine, what I would call like a fine grain tannin.
Yeah. So unique. How do you think, you mentioned this is probably another wine that over 2 or 3 days will evolve in the glass. But do you think there's some ageability to this wine? Obviously, you're using more of a flint colored glass for all of your wines as opposed to
Oh,
green.
yeah. Thanks for asking that. I think the flint colored glass on reds, yeah, that's a little different. And part of what I was up there to there is just to like acknowledge like the ability. For one, I just like to be able to see the color.
Mhm.
And and I've also seen that like, maybe from Europe or some other place, like different regions where I saw red wine in a clear bottle. Like with the Valdiguié, it was like I really liked it there because it was like this brighter, sort of lighter, sort of electric, color. I could see it. So by putting in clear glass, it was like appealing part of the packaging, just being able to see the color. And I'm not like expecting people to, purchase these wines because they have to lay them down, for 10 years or whatever. So I think they're sort of saying, enjoy this wine, drink it. Is, you don't have to like just put it away.
Mhm.
But to your point, like this Valdiguié, I think will age a long time. Like I
Yeah.
think that wine could age a long time. For whatever reason, I think the Valdiguié might age longer than the Charbono.
Hmm.
Maybe just because higher acidity. I'm not sure what. I mean, that's just an instinct on my part. I haven't tried to, like
Yeah,
really
that's
test.
true. If you don't have the sort of tannic base the higher acidity will work. It's acid, tannin, and sugar are sort of the three preservatives of wine. So
But I think the Charbono will age too. Like
yeah.
if you want
Oh,
to age
absolutely.
for 5 years or whatever, I mean, come back longer than that. I'd be curious. Like, I need to set a little bit more aside so that we can do library events and tastings.
Exactly.
And we'll come to the last wine that we're going to taste when I know that we'll get there. That's a wine that I think has lots of ageability ahead of it.
Nice.
The reds.
Yeah, no, you definitely need to put some back so that people can have the, 66 Schramsberg and 66 Champagne experience that you had, but with your 2020 Charbono.
Yeah,
Nice.
true.
Yeah, this is so delicious and so unique, and so many of the Charbonos that I've had, you're right. There's a smoothness to them. They tend to be very polished and refined and have kind of a syrupy note to them, almost a slickness in the mouthfeel to them. Whereas this one is, yeah, it's smoky, it's a little bit rough around the edges. I mean, it feels more like a natural wine than the rest of yours do, but in a good way, where it's, it's not an easy sipping wine, but it's a wine that you can appreciate and enjoy in a very complex way.
So would this go with ribs?
Ribs, brisket, I think like
Oh,
smoked mushrooms would be
yeah, there you go.
phenomenal with this.
I'm glad you're doing a better job of coming up with the vegetarian, but those are great. Mushrooms is a great idea with this. Like
Yeah.
Yeah, and mushrooms out of the oven, or like in a, like imagine like a fired, like a pizza oven that has
Yep.
mushrooms in it, or but I think like the brisket and the ribs, like that definitely. This is interesting with like some different meats too, for sure.
Yeah.
'Cause-
Matt and Carrie threw out Amalfi Coast pasta carbonara. They
ah,
said it works. It's not the most amazing pairing, but it works. I don't know what makes what is an Amalfi Coast carbonara? What like okay, just yeah, exactly. There's still
ah,
bacon and peas and an egg in there somewhere. So
I love the Amalfi Coast. It's an amazing place. I only got to go there once, but
yeah,
I'll take that just to like try to transport myself. But yeah, this is a good pasta wine, I think, with the different kind of types of
yeah.
pastas that, that
The
might have a
smoke
little.
No, the smokiness on this is such a unique characteristic that I think it really needs. Like the other thing I was thinking, because it has that kind of rich, dark cherry. It's almost. It's funny. I had a wine club member who opened this up before the virtual tasting, who was not familiar with Charbono, who mentioned, and I, he mentioned that he thought there was some sort of cough syrupy tones to this, and I will say that I can see what he's thinking of, but I think that's more of that like darker cherry, like almost a bitter cherry richness to it, more of like a maraschino kind of flavor.
Nice.
Which to me, and sorry, Mike and Jeannie, you may want to cover your ears for this one, but like a venison or an elk or like a gamier meat that wants that sort of cherry note, I think would be really interesting. Apparently, Arby's is releasing a burger that has both elk and venison in it with some beef, and this would be a really interesting pairing with that.
Too much.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's move on to our last wine, which is sort of a culmination of everything that we've tasted. This is your 2020 Untold Reds. Again, all old wines, all dry farmed, all from Mendocino. So take us through the creation of this wine. How did you kind of decide to do this culmination of the Charbono, the Valdiguié, the Carignan that you work with, the Barbera, all coming together in this blend?
Well, so I'm definitely motivated about the types of varieties that made me think of like the old California wine experience. And so when I think about, what were some of those varieties, and I know other people have a little different take on it, but for me, it was like on the red side, I thought of Petit Syrah. I thought of, Charbono was an interesting, uh, example.
Yeah.
Barbera was like much more common in older plantings, and it had great acidity. Zinfandel is like synergistic with those things. And Carignan is another. So I like the idea of sort of like, and this wasn't actually a field blend, but that was sort of like the idea. It's like untold red, sort of like untold riches or untold story, or going back and like imagining you're going back to like plantings that were long ago and what was all planted next to each other, and that kind of blend. So that's where the idea behind Untold Reds comes from. And yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I think that's pretty much what I was after. Like the idea of bringing together what might have been, like some old timers, almost like a field blend,
Yeah.
in a wine.
So you fermented all of these separately, and then are you sort of putting the profile together, or are you just kind of, whatever's left over, you're throwing it all in the same batch together?
Well, I mean, I knew that I wanted to put together those kind of varieties that I said
Yeah,
into a blend.
right.
And so, like for example, with Barbera, well, I found an interest in using some of the Barbera, like with the Valdiguié by itself, for example, or there was some other variations, but I was definitely interested in the idea of like putting Carignan, Petit Syrah, Barbera together, and then looking for like 4 or 5 varieties that I felt told a story of sort of like the old California, and being able to put that together in a blend. So that's really how I came up with this.
Nice. Is this something that, vintage to vintage will always remain with those 5 varietals, or will you
Okay.
alter it every year?
So, and that's another good question. That's another reason why, it appealed to me to do to make, one wine, sort of an important wine as a red wine blend, is that it did allow some latitude to be able to keep discovering like new, interesting old vineyard sites, and not to have to change, like it could still be a red wine blend, but it could reflect, new discoveries. It could reflect the fact that things are evolving a little bit from one. Like if I know that I'm trying to find old vine, organic, sort of distinctive, rare, early type California plantings, well, that's not that easy to do. So if I have a blend, it gives me more ability to sort of work with that and evolve it from one vintage to the next. And there may be changes to your point.
Yeah. Yeah. I imagine if you can find a vineyard that's growing some Black Malvoisie, you'll throw that in there.
Right. Yeah. I'll have to ask Greg to follow it.
Or good old Pinot St. George.
Yeah.
All sorts of fun ones. Yeah, super interesting. This blend, and again, love the artwork that your daughter's doing with the different leaf outlines on this one.
It's like the amplography of the leaves.
Yeah, and I've noticed she has this kind of almost like a orange smoke tendril running through at least 3 of the 4 labels.
It's a tendril. It's something that came out of her, one of the photography that she took in the vineyard, and it's like this little tendril that's just like organic extension of grapevine, like these little tendrils. That's what that is. And so, but it was just sort of this wisp, like I don't know, ethereal, or sort of shows a little movement, or energy, like sort of like a little source of energy. Pardon me, one second.
Sure. That is all right. We can all take a little pause and enjoy this while he So, I mean, I know your background is organic, and that's kind of what spurred you to get into the more natural winemaking style. Where do you see the natural winemaking community? Is it something that's growing? Is it still in its infancy? Are you finding more wineries are kind of jumping onto the bandwagon, or it's becoming more popular, more mainstream? I'm really interested in kind of where it's going.
I'm glad you asked this, because this is so important, for where Billy D Wines is today. And, on the one hand, it's fun to sort of like imagine this, like, fringe, too hip, too cool, operating the margins, doing all this sort of eclectic stuff. On the other hand, why not be able to share that with more of the world and actually, grow a natural wine business so that it becomes more impactful and meaningful to a wider range of consumers, and so that it has more impact over how, the land's taken care of, and, acres are grown and all that. So I'm looking to grow as we go forward. And I'm actually looking to raise money for the business. And back to your questions, like I see the natural wine movement as being, it's not a fad. Like I think that, organic food is like increasingly like mandatory for consumers in Europe, for example, and here in the US too. Like these trends are not going away. People are more and more concerned about, what they're, like wine, people don't want glyphosates in their wine. Like they don't want those 70, like secret ingredients that you can put into wine that don't even have to be put on the label, that people have no idea, what's going in there. So I think that, and I think that you're seeing more interest in restraint in the levels of alcohol. And I think that that's, in a way, that's just like turning the clock back to what, we used to do.
Yeah. So
sometimes, some of this, like, hip things are more like, actually, this was, this is not brand new. And natural wine is not brand new. But I will say, sort of like back to your question and your point, that I feel like the natural wine movement is very strong, that and that like generations of consumers that are my daughter, Abby's age, and it's not just her, but are actually demanding it. And so I'm looking to build a more significant business out of Billy D Wines by bringing more people into it, getting more people involved, and looking for investment to grow the business.
Yeah. I have to ask, how do you think that the change in climate change is going to affect natural winemaking? Obviously the conditions in California and Napa and Paso, all across the state, very different than what the weather patterns, the terroir, if you will, that was being faced in the 60s, 70s, 80s. So how do you think that's going to affect natural winemaking in the future?
Well, I think that what's happening with so much change and sort of new records and unpredictability in climate is just like is something that we're staring down for everything related to what we know about our lives. And with respect to wine, it also has a lot of significance. And there's no question that these areas that we're growing grapes in are becoming warmer like quickly. I mean, when we're seeing like the differences in average temperatures and heat summation and earlier times of harvesting compared to what was known in the past. So now, how is with respect to natural wine, specifically, I think it's affecting all wine. I think that for me at Billy D, that part of what like the positioning of Billy D and the choice of varietals is actually these are good choices for the fact that we're facing changes. I think that looking at grapes like Barbera, Chenin Blanc, Carignan, these wines have like vibrancy and acidity. These varietals do, that I think will be very, very helpful as now I'm not wishing for temperatures to increase, but these varieties are good choices in the kind of changing conditions that we're looking at. So that's just one angle. I think that water is a big concern. So how do we farm grapes without having to rely on so much use of water? And it so happens that the vineyards that I'm getting grapes from are not irrigating very much at all or any. Like most of this is all dry farm. So how do you continue to evolve that and grow it and scale it from a farming standpoint in the future? I mean, there are certainly challenges there.
Yeah. No, I
But
understand. Go ahead.
But I think lightweight packaging is another super, super important thing.
Yeah.
So the bottles that we use at Billy D are yes, these are glass bottles. And so there's, people can talk about that and debate, whether it's cardboard or, plastic liners, which I'm not, as a consumer, don't really like drinking out of plastic. So that's another factor. But if you're using glass, make it the lightest weight glass that you possibly can. These bottles weigh half of what some of these sort of trophy wine bottles weigh, or even less than that.
Yeah.
And little lightweight, Billy D bottles, super, super lightweight glass. So I think that that's important. And you're asking about changing environment and
yeah. I mean, I'm thinking with some of these grapes, we have, it's not just the heat spikes that we're seeing or the drought, but it's also, we're seeing much lower temperatures. It feels like there's been more frost issues creeping later and later into the season, into your March and April, either, preventing bud break or God forbid, creating shatter and destroying buds after there's been a heat spike and all of a sudden we have a huge frost. So I'm just wondering if some of these older vineyards that you're working with are a little more immune to that because of the resistance and they've been there for so long.
So I think that there is some robustness of some of these great old vineyards, but you're making a good point that yes, you're right. These events are more extreme in both directions, and that we're having huge amounts of water or flooding or cold temperatures and frost. And it's true that, 21 actually was a rough year up in Mendocino for like this sort of winter kill frost. It came very early, like it was in November, not like after bud break, but it was so cold that it basically just hammered and stunted, the vines, like period. Didn't have anything to do with like the new shoots coming out or the flowering or whatever. But it basically just, killed off like the arms and the productivity of the vines for that whole season. So yeah, what can you do about that? As a natural winemaker or as a conventional, uh,
Yeah.
practice person? I mean, there's some big questions.
Everyone's in the same fight, it sounds like. And yeah, I mean, we had rain here in August and September, right around Labor Day in Paso Robles, which is unheard of. And so you had winemakers scrambling, even though some of their grapes hadn't even had veraison yet, but they're now worried about mold and mildew, which is something that we've never had to worry about in the late summer, late part of the harvest here in Paso. So unique going on. I will point
I
out
mean,
Matt and Carrot. Oh, go ahead.
diversification can help. The idea of
Yeah.
like having multiple vineyard sites. Not having everything all in one place. Maybe having grapes that are coming from a couple different districts. Can be helpful. Different varieties, different vineyards. So that I think it's been helpful for me.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. And the fact that you're, I mean, able to source from lots of different places, Mendocino, Clarksburg, that gives you some flexibility in the market, which is nice to kind of work with what you want to work with.
So this Untold Reds,
yeah,
it's got some firmness in the palate, right? I mean, would people agree with that? It's definitely got some tannins. It's really fruit tannins. I mean, it's like they're not wood tannins, so that I can tell you. But it has like a firmness of a structure, and it's coming from Petit Syrah, Carignan, Barbera, and a small amount of Charbono.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely like, to me, the tannins from that Carignan definitely kind of stand out. As well as the Petit Syrah. You can definitely feel that grip, but then it has such great acidity from the Charbono and the Barbera and even the Valdiguié that it's just a really beautiful balance between the two.
It's juicy, like it,
Yes.
and I think that's one of the traits of, some of these wines coming out of like the natural winemaking vibe have like a real juiciness of that fruitfulness. And I think using some whole cluster fermentation, helps sort of communicate that. But yeah, it's like it's fresh. It's fresh and it's got grip and texture and tannins and all that at the same time. But it's got a lot of fruit. I mean, the aromatics are, there's like really really bright aromatics, black fruits and red fruits, cranberry, like pomegranate, different things going on there.
No, it's such a wide variety of grapes that you're using on this with so many different flavor profiles that yeah, it just adds to the complexity. And I think that you're using grapes, and obviously you're picking grapes at a higher pH, lower Brix level, so bringing that acidity brings more of that juiciness, that mouth wateringness to this wine, which really counters those tannins quite nicely.
This wine will age. I mean,
Yeah.
you're asking about aging. I mean, I could see this wine aging a long time.
Absolutely. And as I was saying, Matt and Carrie paired this with Moroccan baked chicken with 11 spices. El Hanout is apparently the name of the spice mix that they blended with, which I love that spicy component. I can definitely see with so many different flavor components to this wine, that Moroccan spice, that richness to it, really pairing nicely with this.
That sounds awesome.
Nice. Excellent. So as we start to wrap up here, what does the future hold for Billy D and Ramble? You mentioned you're obviously seeking some investment to kind of expand the brand. Are there any new vineyards, new grapes, new wines that you're targeting or have in barrel that you're looking to put out there soon?
I would say that with respect to the varietals, I'm keeping sort of this family of varietals that I've gotten onto so far. So on the white side, Chenin Blanc and French Colombard are the most important for me. I might, pick up something of another white if it were from old vines and, certified organic. I mean, I might even pick, I'm not sure, it might be a little too late for this year, but Muscat, there's some like really old plantings of Muscat. I wouldn't
Was
make
the
it in a
first thing
sweet
in my
spot.
mind when you said, old California varietals
I
was the
would
first
do it
thing.
in a dry style, but like sort of synergistic with like the Chenin and the French Colombard and the Muscat. Um, on the red side, Valdiguié, Carignan, Petit Syrah, Zinfandel, Barbera, um, Charbono. I mean, I think that's sort of enough. And each of those really like meets my, sort of metric of like what I remember of, old school varieties that I remember in my own experience. So yes, there are other, I mean, there's old vine Grenache, there's old vine, all kinds of other stuff, but I sort of picked the ones that I remembered, like from my own upbringing that I saw, in the landscape during the experience, growing up in an earlier time of California wine. So yeah, I'm sticking with those things. And um, vineyard sites, I mean, I continue to seek out, and I've, like this year, I've added 3 new vineyards this year that I didn't have ever before. And they're all like old vine, organic, sort of old school farmers farming organically with like these same kind of varieties that I want. Like Pamela Rossetti, I've been talking to her for like 3 or 4 years. She finally said, "Okay, Billy, you're in this year." Testa up in Mendocino, certified organic, like old vine, Barbera, other varieties like
Nice.
Petit and Carignan. Venturi, another like old school, really, these are great vineyards. So
Yeah.
I've actually been able to expand my vineyard sites, sort of like opening up to pave the way to be able to do more and, share this with more people.
Yeah, I love it. So unique, so different. And yet, just so simple in terms of the uh uh getting back to the roots of California and the early days of California winemaking that unfortunately after the Judgment of Paris were forgotten by a lot of people.
Mhm.
Yes. So if folks want to pick up additional bottles, get in contact with you. I don't know if there's a way for them to taste when they're up in the Geyserville area where you make your wines or whatnot. But what's the best way for folks to get in touch with you or pick up more wines?
Okay, well, feel free to share my email address,
Yeah,
with anybody.
we will.
And it's BD, like Billy D, at billydwines.com. And so anybody's welcome to reach out to me that way. I live in the Napa Valley, where it all began for me. And I'm in St. Helena, where, I went from nursery school through the end of high school. And yes, I'm over in Sonoma and Mendocino a lot and up in the vineyards of Mendocino. I'm making the wine at a Sonoma County winery, which is working out great for me. The wines, can be, I mean, billydwines.com, has many of these wines available in the Bay Area. A great wine shop called Paul Marcus Wines in Rockridge, Oakland. I love those guys. I mean, they have like 6 of my wines there.
Nice.
Sunshine is a good store in St. Helena that sells, different wines of mine. Gus's Community Markets in San Francisco, sells especially like the Billy D bottles. But if anybody has questions or is looking for something or wants me to, quote, like say somebody might want a mixed case or something and they
Yeah.
might want to ask for a price or whatever, I could just send me an email and I could do that.
Yep. Yeah, and tomorrow when we send out the link to the replay of this, we'll include your email on that so folks can get in touch with you. But billydwines.com is the best way to get a hold of him in the short term if you need to, and can check out everything in the portfolio. Billy, this has been wonderful. Such a fun dip into both California history and kind of the future of California winemaking, which I love. It's such a again a dichotomy between the two things, but you're really making it work. So this has been wonderful. If you don't mind sticking around for a couple of minutes, if anybody has any questions they want to ask Billy, you can go ahead and unmute yourself, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer or
Absolutely.
take any comments you guys have.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone
Yeah, you're welcome.
for being part of this discussion here tonight, for being
Yeah.
part of this community.
Oh, and I should mention before we do that, our next email will be going out on Tuesday for October. We're going to be featuring our first slate of international wines ever for the Forgotten Grapes Wine Club. I have a German wine importer, a young lady I met who lives down in San Luis Obispo named Lisa Tupetz. She's going to be featuring some wines from some really interesting German purveyors. There will be no Rieslings, I promise. True Forgotten Grapes from Germany. We're going to be doing some really, really interesting stuff with her. So keep an eye out for that email next month. Our first international foray. We're leaving California for Germany for a month with this. So
Nice going, Chris.
thank you, Billy. I
Thank
appreciate it. All right, if anybody wants to ask Billy any questions, feel free. Or if not, we are potentially trying to get a Blaufränkisch in there. We will see. It's going to be a game time decision. Lisa has a container that is arriving in California sometime in late September. Nope, you're close enough. So we will see if that will be part of it. It's going to be a race against time, which is part of the fun of this one. But I'm going to stop the recording now. So thank you, everybody.